Part 1, Amerigo Vespucci, the man behind the name. It's the end of the 15th century. Europe is restless. Empires hunger for gold, for power, for glory, but above all, for knowledge. The great ocean to the west, once drawn as a blank space filled with monsters and whispers, now pulls at the minds of explorers. Christopher Columbus has crossed it. He has returned with stories of strange lands, new peoples, and endless horizons. But what, exactly, has he found? Asia, as he claimed? Or something else entirely? Among the men who would seek that answer was a quiet Florentine named Amerigo Vespucci. Born in Florence, Italy, in 1454, Vespucci wasn't a sailor by birth. He wasn't the type to swing a sword or climb the rigging of a storm-tossed ship. He was a thinker, a merchant, a scholar, a man of numbers and navigation. He worked for one of the most powerful families in Florence, the Medici, managing trade and correspondence across the known world. But destiny, as it often does, would call him far from his comfortable desk. When Columbus's news reached Italy, it sent a shockwave through the halls of power. A new world, he claimed, had been reached, the Indies, perhaps China, maybe even Japan. Letters spread across Europe like wildfire, and every noble and merchant dreamed of the riches of the East. But to Vespucci, something didn't quite fit. He studied the maps. He read the accounts. He calculated distances, latitudes, stars. And he thought, if Columbus reached Asia, why do his descriptions not match the East we know? The plants, the animals, the stars in the night sky, they spoke of a different world. In 1497, Vespucci's chance came. He joined a Spanish expedition heading west across the Atlantic, perhaps under the flag of Castile, perhaps unofficially, records are uncertain, but the man himself would later write of it in vivid detail. He described reaching a vast continent, teeming with life, rivers wider than any in Europe, coastlines stretching far beyond imagination. It was not a handful of islands like Columbus's Indies, it was something grander, stranger, and unmistakably new. In one of his letters, Vespucci wrote, "We have discovered a continent in those southern regions, more populous and more full of animals than are Europe or Asia or Africa." A continent. It was a word that changed everything. Vespucci's voyages took him along the coastlines of what we now know as Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela. He studied the skies, learning to measure the positions of stars to calculate longitude, an astonishing skill for his time. He wrote about the people he met, their customs, their languages, their ways of life. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who saw only conquest and gold, Amerigo tried to understand. He observed. He described. He documented. And his words spread. They spread through letters, written to friends, to patrons, to the learned men of Europe. Some were private, some were published without his permission, but all carried the same unmistakable idea. These lands are not Asia. They are something else. A new world. Now, imagine Europe at that time, a continent still steeped in medieval thought, where maps were half scripture, half guesswork. Suddenly, Vespucci's letters described a land that didn't fit anywhere on their worldviews. It wasn't on the Ptolemaic charts, it wasn't in the ancient texts, it was beyond them all. The letters electrified readers. Printers rushed to copy them. Scholars debated them in universities and taverns alike. And then, in 1507, something remarkable happened. A group of German mapmakers, led by a man named Martin Waldseemüller, published a new map of the world, Universalis Cosmographia. It was the most advanced map of its age, the first to show the newly discovered western lands as a separate continent, apart from Asia. And on that map, written across the strange new territory, was a name that would echo forever. America. Why America? Because Waldseemüller and his fellow scholars had read Vespucci's letters, the Mundus Novus, New World, and the Lettera al Soderini. In those writings, Amerigo described the new lands with passion, detail, and wonder, not as mere islands, but as a full, independent world. The mapmakers were so convinced by his descriptions that they credited him as the true discoverer of the New World, and in Latin, Amerigo became Americus. To match the feminine form of other continents like Europa and Asia, they wrote America. It was, at first, a scholarly gesture, a quiet honor in a corner of a single map. No one could have known that it would one day name half the planet. History is strange that way. Columbus, the man who crossed the ocean first, never realized he had found a new continent. He died believing he had reached Asia. Vespucci, who followed, simply looked closer, thought deeper, and dared to say, no. This is a new world. And for that, his name would live forever. But Vespucci himself? He wasn't chasing immortality. He wanted understanding. In his letters, you can feel a tone of awe, a merchant-turned-explorer who had stood on the shores of a world no European had ever seen, who had watched unfamiliar constellations rise over alien jungles and thought, so this is creation, larger than any of us ever knew. In his later years, Amerigo settled in Seville, Spain, where he worked for the government as a chief navigator. He trained new captains, organized expeditions, and built the charts that would guide Spain's empire across the Atlantic. He was precise, methodical, devoted to accuracy. And though his own voyages were over, his influence only grew. The mapmakers of Europe continued to print and reprint that fateful map of 1507. Each copy spread the name America farther, to scholars, kings, and commoners alike. The name took root. It passed from maps to atlases, from sailors' tongues to royal decrees. Soon, there was no other word for the new lands across the sea. America. A name born from observation, from intellect, from curiosity, not conquest. From a man who asked questions instead of declaring certainties. And yet, few today remember Amerigo Vespucci as more than a name in a textbook. Who was he, really? What drove him to challenge Columbus's claims? Was he a hero of truth, or a clever opportunist who seized the fame that history denied another? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between myth and man. In the next chapter, we'll follow Amerigo's own letters, his vivid, controversial accounts that spread across Europe like wildfire, and see how they shaped the very idea of the New World. We'll discover how one man's pen changed geography, belief, and even identity itself. Because names, after all, are powerful things. They tell us not just where we are, but who we are. And for better or worse, America carries his name. Part 2, The Letters That Shaped the World. History isn't always written by kings or captains. Sometimes, it begins with a man sitting by candlelight, dipping his pen into ink, and describing what he has seen beyond the edge of the world. For Amerigo Vespucci, his legacy was not built upon cannons or conquest, it was built upon letters. Those letters, scattered across Europe between 1497 and 1504, would set fire to imagination itself. They bore titles like Mundus Novus, the New World, and Lettera al Soderini. Written in the elegant, almost poetic Latin of the day, they were travelogues and confessionals in one. They told of endless coastlines, of constellations unseen from the old world, of peoples with customs so different that they seemed to belong to another creation entirely. In one letter, Vespucci wrote, "I have discovered a continent inhabited by more numerous peoples and animals than are Europe, Asia, or Africa." To the readers of 1500, that single sentence shattered centuries of geography. 3 continents. That was all God had made, said the ancients. Europe, Asia, and Africa. To suggest there was a fourth was almost heresy. And yet, Vespucci's calm tone left little room for doubt. He measured the stars. He compared the length of the days. He watched how the Southern Cross rose above the horizon, a constellation no European had seen before. The evidence was written across the sky. He was not in Asia. He was somewhere entirely new. But the true power of those letters lay not just in what they said, but how they said it. Unlike Columbus, whose journals were technical and pious, Vespucci wrote with wonder. He described the smell of tropical rain, the red soils of the coast, the laughter of native children who had never seen iron before. He wrote not as a conqueror, but as a witness. To the scholars of Europe, weary of war and hungry for discovery, his voice felt honest, almost scientific. Soon, printers in Paris, Nuremberg, Venice, and Basel rushed to copy his letters. Each edition multiplied like wildfire through a continent newly intoxicated by the printing press. Ordinary citizens who had never seen the sea read of forests that stretched beyond sight, parrots more colorful than jewels, and men and women living without kings, coins, or churches. For the first time, Europeans imagined that the world might be bigger than their faith or their empires. But fame comes with shadows. As Vespucci's name spread, so did envy and doubt. Was he truly the discoverer he claimed to be? Had he really sailed before Columbus? Had his letters been exaggerated, or even edited, by eager publishers hungry for sales? No one can say for certain. What we do know is that the letters attributed to Vespucci differ in tone and detail. Some speak with the clear precision of an astronomer, others read like adventure tales polished for the market. Scholars still argue which were genuine and which were embellished. To his critics, Amerigo was an opportunist, a clever clerk who stole glory with ink instead of courage. To his defenders, he was a man of science, one who saw truth where others saw legend. The controversy grew fierce after 1507, when Wald-Seemüller's map christened the new land, America. How, many asked, could a man who never led a great fleet or claimed a colony give his name to a hemisphere? Should not Columbus, who first crossed the Atlantic, be honored instead? The answer lies not in politics, but in perception. Columbus believed until his dying day that he had reached Asia. Vespucci, through calculation and courage of thought, declared it a new world. The mapmakers, seeking logic in a world of shifting truths, chose to honor the man who named what it truly was. In doing so, they rewarded intellect over authority, the thinker over the adventurer. And yet, Amerigo himself may never have known. When Wald-Seemüller's map appeared, Vespucci had been dead for months. He died in 1512 in Seville, modestly employed as chief navigator to the Spanish crown, leaving behind charts, notes, and a reputation both admired and resented. The great irony of his life, he never called the continent America himself. Still, his words refused to die. Each letter, copied and recopied, became a spark in the European imagination. The term New World entered every language. Artists painted fantastical scenes of naked natives greeting European ships. Poets wrote of paradise found across the sea. Merchants dreamed of spices and gold. Kings dreamed of empires. But buried within Vespucci's letters was something subtler, the birth of curiosity itself. He described how the people he met lived without rulers, guided by natural law. He marveled that they shared property, treated strangers kindly, and seemed free from greed. His words hinted that civilization might exist outside Christendom's walls. To many European philosophers, that idea was explosive. 2 centuries later, when men like Locke, Rousseau, and Jefferson pondered liberty, they too would speak of the New World as a symbol, not just of geography, but of freedom from the past. They saw America as a place where old hierarchies dissolved, where humanity might begin again. That vision, distant descendant of Vespucci's wonder, would shape revolutions. Still, back in 1500, Amerigo could not have imagined such consequences. He was merely a man recording what he saw, the stars, the coastlines, the faces of strangers who would soon face unimaginable change. He wrote with curiosity, not conquest. And in that difference lay his immortality. But time would blur his portrait. By the mid-16th century, some accused him of forgery. Spanish chroniclers sought to restore Columbus's honor. Italian patriots defended their countrymen. The debate raged in courts, universities, and salons, who truly discovered the New World. Yet while scholars quarreled, the name had already taken root on every map, every globe, every schoolroom wall. America was no longer a scholar's experiment. It was a reality. Names, once spoken by enough mouths, become unerasable. By the time explorers like Magellan, Pizarro, and Cortés sailed west, the label America had spread to the northern continent as well. What began as a tribute to a Florentine observer now stretched from Patagonia to the Arctic Circle. The name had outgrown the man. And so, Amerigo Vespucci, the merchant's clerk, the reluctant navigator, the curious mind, found himself transformed into myth. Some would call him a thief of glory, others, a prophet of discovery. But all would speak his name. In the end, perhaps he would have smiled at the irony. He had sought truth in the stars, not fame on the shore. Yet it was fame that found him, inked across the face of the world. In our next and final part, we'll explore how this single name, America, evolved from a scholarly label on a German map into a living identity embraced by generations. We'll watch how Vespucci's quiet legacy became the foundation of a new civilization, and how, centuries later, that name would inspire both unity and conflict. Because names, once given, are never just words. They are promises, and destinies. Part 3, Legacy, Myth, and the Birth of an American Identity. Names are like seeds. Once planted, they grow roots in places their creators could never imagine. So it was with America. A name written on a German map by scholars who never left Europe. A name born from letters written by a Florentine merchant staring at a sky full of strange stars. A name that would one day define nations, ideals, and even dreams. But how did a word inked 5 centuries ago become an identity felt in every heartbeat of a continent? To answer that, we have to follow the echo of Amerigo Vespucci's name, across time, across oceans, into the birth of a civilization. When Waldseemüller's 1507 map declared the western lands, America, few noticed. It was an intellectual curiosity, a cartographer's flourish. But over the next decades, explorers redrew coastlines, chroniclers wrote histories, and mapmakers copied maps upon maps. The word spread like ink in water. By the mid-1500s, Spanish and Portuguese navigators used America to describe not just Brazil, but the northern lands too. By the 1600s, English and Dutch settlers called their colonies, in America. The name had transcended its origin, no longer just an honor for a Florentine thinker, but a definition for a new world and a new idea of humanity. And yet, through it all, the real Amerigo Vespucci remained half-forgotten. While Columbus's statues rose in plazas and his name filled history books, Vespucci's lay quietly beneath layers of debate. Was he a hero or a thief? A visionary or a lucky clerk whose letters happened to charm scholars? By the Enlightenment, the argument no longer mattered. The world had accepted the name. America was real and powerful. But here's the remarkable thing. The continent didn't just inherit a name. It inherited a spirit. Vespucci's letters had described a place that seemed freer, larger, more natural, untouched by Europe's old hierarchies. The very idea of a new world carried a whisper of rebirth, of possibility. It said, here, humanity can start over. Here, we can build something new. That whisper became a roar. When settlers crossed the Atlantic centuries later, they carried more than possessions, they carried dreams of freedom. They saw the new world not just as land, but as hope itself. The name America became synonymous with beginnings. And so, as colonies formed, cities rose, and revolutions burned, the name gained weight. America was no longer a word on parchment, it was a vision of destiny. Think of it, by the late 18th century, when 13 colonies declared independence from Britain, they did so not as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans. A title born not from kings, but from a mapmaker's pen. They embraced it willingly, proudly. To be American meant something new, to believe in progress, in liberty, in the idea that one could define oneself. And though the continent still carried the scars of conquest and the tragedy of the peoples who came before, the name grew to embody both triumph and contradiction, light and shadow intertwined. Amerigo Vespucci never saw any of this. He died in 1512, quietly, his name only beginning its strange journey. But his legacy lived not in monuments, but in imagination. He had looked upon new lands and dared to say, "This is a new world." That single phrase changed the course of human thought. And that's what history often forgets: discovery isn't just about ships and sails, it's about recognition. Columbus crossed the ocean, but Vespucci realized what he had found. He gave the world new meaning. And meaning, once born, is harder to erase than empires. Still, as centuries passed, his name was both honored and contested. In some corners, he was remembered as a symbol of intellect, the man who saw the truth others missed. In others, he was branded a usurper who stole another's glory. But whether loved or hated, one fact endured: the entire hemisphere carried his name. By the time of the founding of the United States, America had already become a symbol that outgrew geography. It wasn't just a continent. It was an idea, of courage, self-invention, rebellion, and reinvention. Even the phrase, "the American dream," would later echo that same ancient spark, the belief that one can look beyond the horizon and find something new. And in a poetic twist of fate, that was precisely what Amerigo Vespucci had done. Let's step back for a moment. Imagine the man himself, standing on the deck of a small wooden ship off the coast of South America. The air is warm, thick with salt and the scent of unknown forests. He looks to the sky. The constellations are wrong, unfamiliar, inverted. He takes notes by lantern light, trying to map a world that doesn't fit on any chart he knows. He feels the pull of something bigger than himself, something that will outlast his lifetime. He doesn't know that his name will one day stretch across mountains and oceans. He doesn't know that future generations will pledge allegiance to a flag bearing that name. He doesn't know that it will become a beacon to millions, a promise of freedom, of struggle, of hope. He simply writes what he sees. And that act, that simple, human act of observation, becomes immortality. So what, then, is the true legacy of Amerigo Vespucci? It isn't conquest or discovery in the traditional sense. It's perspective. It's the courage to ask, what if the world is bigger than we think? And that question, more than any voyage, is what defines the human spirit. For every explorer who has set sail since, for every scientist, artist, or dreamer who has looked at the unknown and said, "Let's find out," Vespucci's spark is there, alive, quietly burning. America, the name, the nation, the idea, carries that inheritance. It carries both wonder and responsibility. Because a name that once meant, the new world, now belongs to hundreds of millions who must decide what that world stands for. Will it stand for discovery, for liberty, for progress? Or will it forget the humility of the man who first realized that there was more to see? The story of Amerigo Vespucci reminds us that knowledge is not owned, it's shared. That truth can emerge from anyone, anywhere, even from a merchant's clerk who dared to look at the stars. More than 500 years later, when someone says, America, they're invoking not just a place, but a promise that began with curiosity, not conquest. A promise that the world can always be rediscovered. And maybe that's the real meaning behind the name. Not a tribute to one man, but to an idea. That humanity's journey never ends. That there is always another horizon. And that sometimes, the greatest discoveries begin not with a ship, but with a question. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.